Hi, good morning to all of you. I welcome you again to my channel Econo Pathshala. Today is the final session in the series of macroeconomic environment. We have discussed about different macroeconomic indicators which define macroeconomic environment in an economy. So in that series, today is the fourth session. In the first session, we discussed about GDP, economic growth, how they reflect overall economic activities in terms of aggregate production, aggregate income generation in an economy, and how it is used as a proxy for overall economic welfare. And the economic growth, which defines the rate at which GDP is growing, reflect how overall economic welfare in an economy is changing over time. And then the second session, we discussed about employment, unemployment, general prices, inflation. So basically, through employment, people earn their income, and if the employment rate in an economy is high, that basically reflects, most of the people are able to work. They are able to contribute to the production process in an economy, and through that they earn and maintain standard of living, their standard of living. And if unemployment is high, then that is a matter of concern, which not only reflects that the productive potential of an economy for a country are not used properly, and different households who are interested to contribute by working, contributing in different production of different goods and services, they are not able to do so. So they are not earning, and then their standard of living is suffering. Then we discussed about general prices, which basically measures the cost of living, indicator like CPI, index like CPI, which measures the cost of living in an economy. So, if somebody's income is growing, but the cost of living is basically outpacing that growth, then obviously the standard of living of the citizens will not improve. Then we have discussed about inflation, which reflects the continuous surge in general prices. And if inflation is high and uncertain, that is inimical to economic growth. As well, it affects the standard of living of the people. Then we talked about in the last session about savings and investment, how they set the foundation for long-term prosperity of an economy, and how a sound and efficient financial system help in mobilization of savings and converting such savings into productive investment, which is critical for enhancing economic welfare in an economy. And then today we'll be using broad macroeconomic indicators drawn from public finance, that is the government finances, and external sector, to sort of understand about the overall macroeconomic environment. Particularly certain public finance indicators like government deficit or fiscal deficit and current account deficit, if they are large, which are interlinked, that may lead to vulnerability of macroeconomic conditions in a country. So that way, today we'll conclude about discussing all key macroeconomic indicators which economists use to assess about macroeconomic conditions in an economy. So let us start with government finances. So obviously government finances, there is government expenditure, and there is government receipts. Now what is the rationale for government expenditure? Traditionally, government or state provides various types of useful services. Say, services pertaining to general administration, um, you know, national security, both in terms of defense to protect the country from external aggression, and maintaining law and order internally, providing judicial services. These are the traditional services which government or state provide. And then added to that, various economic services like health, public health services, education, provision of physical infrastructure like roads, railways, uh, you know ports, communication, and power, like electrification and all. These are the essential economic services which are provided by the government, not only to make the life of citizens comfortable, but also support industrial and production activities in an economy. Now, when we talk about there are spending requirements, obviously this spending has to be made from some sources. So, bulk of the government's spending requirements are funded by tax revenue and other fees and royalties collected by the government. Okay, but the fact of matter is, in a developing country, for that matter, in most of the economies, the spending requirements of the government exceed the amount of revenue mobilized by the government through tax and non-tax revenues. So, in that context, there is a need for government borrowing to meet the difference between the excess government expenditure as compared to government revenue, and such borrowings, which we call government deficit or fiscal deficit, over time adds to government's debt. So government's debt is basically accumulation of deficits over the years. So this is a summary of Union budget presented by Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman on 1st of February 2026. So this basically includes key items of budget, key items of receipts, expenditure and deficit for the Government of India for different years. So let me first talk about the revenue receipts. As you can see from the screen, in 2026-27, that is the current year, the revenue receipts were to the tune of 35 lakh crore, okay, or 35 trillion, and then overall receipts were around 53 trillion. Okay, so that reflects, bulk of the government's receipts are mobilized through revenue receipts like tax and non-tax revenue. Then there are capital receipts. Out of that, the item number 7, the borrowings and other liabilities, as you can see, that is the largest component, to the tune of nearly 17 trillion or 17 lakh crore in 2016-17. Okay, so that is what is fiscal deficit. You can see the item number 7 and item number 17 are matching. Okay, so fiscal deficit is nothing but government's borrowings and other liabilities, and of course there are some recovery of loans and small items of capital receipt. So the then in expenditure, you can see different items of expenditure, particularly interest payment, grants and aid for capital creation. Okay, and then different deficit items provided from item number column number 15 up to 18. So fiscal deficit, which basically reflects the government's borrowing requirements, is the key fiscal indicator which are used by economists and analysts to assess about the government finance. And the earlier table, the figures were very difficult to get clarity on contribution of different components. So in this slide you can see the contribution of different items to overall revenue are listed. So as you can see, borrowings and other liabilities contributed to nearly 24% of total receipts. So nearly 24%, 1/4 of total receipts are comes from borrowing or fiscal deficit. Okay, and the remaining are largely tax and non-tax revenue. You can see the relative importance of different items. Income tax contributes nearly 21%, tax on corporate profit that contributes nearly 18%, so 20% each roughly. So 40% comes from these direct taxes of income and corporate tax, and GST contributes to nearly 15%. So this summarizes the contribution of different items to the receipts of budget for 2026-27. Key to note, the fiscal deficit contributes to nearly 24% or nearly one quarter of total receipt. Now here I have different items of expenditure. They are proportional sort of contribution to overall expenditure. So as you can see here, you mark interest payment constitute nearly 20% of total expenditure. So interest payment is basically your burden of government debt on the past deficits which government have incurred, so that led to accumulation of debt, and the interest payment is paid uh, on that debt. So if the proportion of debt will be high, obviously the interest rates will basically eat away a larger proportion of total expenditure, which is basically restricting the government's ability to spend on different developmental activities like setting up schools, colleges, health center facilities, or putting physical infrastructure in terms of roads and highways. And a large part of union government's budget also goes to the states as transfers. You can see state share of taxes is nearly 22%, and finance commissioner and other transfers to states is around 7%. So nearly 30% of union government's expenditure, that is government of India expenditure, is in terms of transfer to the states. So now let me present the trend of different government deficit indicators for Government of India. So you focus on the blue line at the top. So around 2017-18, fiscal deficit to GDP ratio was nearly 3.5%, a similar figure for 18-19. And in the view of economic slowdown which had set in 2019-20, there was a rise in fiscal deficit to GDP ratio to 4.6%. And during the COVID year, there was a need for heavy fiscal stimulus to save the economy from severe economic contraction. So that reflected in rise in government borrowing, and fiscal deficit to GDP ratio was nearly 9.2% in 2021. Then after the COVID pandemic year, that is 2020-21, there is a gradual fiscal consolidation following the broad principles under Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act 2003, which stipulates that in the medium term, the fiscal deficit to GDP ratio should be around 3% to maintain healthy government finances. And the correction process has started immediately from 2021-22, and in the current year, gross fiscal deficit to GDP ratio is budgeted to be 4.3% of GDP. Now, the deficit indicators has a reflection in the uh, trend of government debt. So as percentage of GDP, as you can see, government debt was quite under control, less than 50% up to 2018-19. Then in COVID-19 year, that exceeded 61%. Okay, and gradually again there is a correction as the fiscal deficit got moderated. This also reflected in reduction of government debt to GDP ratio, and in the year 2016-17, government debt to GDP ratio is budgeted to be 55.6%. So basically, the indicators of government deficit and government debt reflects overall macroeconomic vulnerability. Basically, if the government finances are sound, that is government debt is at a moderate level and government borrowing is at a moderate level, then that is good for long-term prospect of public finances. And that also save the economy from facing macroeconomic imbalances and economic crisis. Now, the point is there is a strong interlinkage between the government finances, and the external sector. So before going to this interlinkage, let me talk about what do I mean by the external sector. So today, no country in the world lives in isolation. Countries are exporting goods and services to other country. Basically, the goods and services produced in India is sold abroad in the United States, in the Europe, in Japan, in UAE. So these are India's exports. Similarly, we are consuming many goods and services which are produced abroad. We are importing from US, we are importing from UAE, we are importing from China. Okay, so these are basically exports of goods and services. When we are buying goods and services from abroad, it is import. When we are selling goods and services abroad, these are our exports. Now, in addition to the exports and imports, which we put under foreign trade, there are a huge amount of cross-border capital flows which happened after opening the economy, Indian economy, since early 90s. Okay, so in the form of FDI, foreign direct investment, uh, FII, foreign institutional investments, even foreign currency denominated bank deposits, we are receiving huge amount of savings from abroad which are invested in India. Okay. Similarly, Indians also are taking part of their savings abroad and investing in a foreign country. Okay, so there are cross-border capital inflows when investment comes to India, that is foreign savings are invested in India. There are foreign investment outflow when we are purchasing assets abroad, like bonds, equities, and the production facilities. Okay, so these are basically cross-border capital flows. So the balance of payment is basically a statement which summarizes these international transactions in terms of goods and services, that is foreign trade, as well cross-border capital flows. So the balance of payment consists of two parts. The first component is current account. So current account records trade in goods, that is physical goods basically tangible goods, like say textile product or coal, iron ore, engineering products, these are tangible goods. Okay, then current account also records trades in services and transfer, the services provided by Indian software companies, BPO services, uh, and the transfers, remittances which you are receiving from Indians working abroad. These inflows and outflows are recorded under trade in services and transfers. So these two constitute current account, and capital account basically records the cross-border flow of funds. So in the next slide, I'll give you some figures which basically reflects how foreign trade has become critical or growing in importance in the recent years compared to some 30 years before. So as you can see from the left hand side, figures of exports and imports in $1 million is given for exports, imports, and trade deficit. So the orange color line reflects India's imports in $1 million, which is nearly $700 million in 2024-25. The blue line represents India's mercantile exports, that is exports of goods. Okay, and the red color line reflects the deficit, that is mercantile imports over exports. So imports are more than exports, so it is reflected in deficit. You can see the red line after 98 99, you see it is becoming strongly negative. But to observe, prior to the 90s, the volume of exports, imports were quite subdued. And after India opened up to foreign trade, rationalized imports, basically rationalized tariffs, phased out the quotas. So there was a significant increase in the volume of imports, and the export promotion policies also ensured that exports significantly increased during the post-reform period. So you see huge increase in volume of exports and imports during the post-reform period in India. And on the right hand side, these mercantile exports imports are given as a proportion of GDP. So prior to 90s, the exports as a percentage of GDP was hardly 5%, and after that the ratio increased gradually, and by 2014-15 it exceeded 15% and got moderated slightly in last decade or so, hovering in the range of 10 to 15%. But imports are continuously exceeding as a percent of GDP compared to the exports. This is about the exports of goods. Now if we add the exports and imports of services and transfer, then we get what is India's current account. So basically India's current account, as I mentioned earlier, this is a combination of trade in goods as well as trade in services and transfers like remittances. So as a percentage of GDP, you can observe that there is a continuous rise in India's current account, both in terms of exports and imports. And but the difference between mercantile exports and imports, which we refer as trade deficit, which was nearly to the tune of 6 to 7% of GDP for the recent years, is moderated because of India's surplus in exports of services compared to imports and receipt of transfers, right? So that's how the current account deficit is moderate to the tune of 1 to 2% of GDP compared to 6 to 7% of GDP of trade deficit in mercantile trade. Then in this slide, I am giving a summary of balance of payment, which is a statement of exports, imports, capital flows of India with the rest of the world for the year 2019-20. As you can, these figures are in $1,000,000. So as you can see, mercantile exports of India in 1920 was to the tune of 320 billion dollar, and mercantile exports imports significantly exceeded at 4.78 billion dollar, and trade deficit was nearly 160 billion dollar. However, this trade deficit of 160 is compensated to a large extent by trade in invisibles, that is trade in services and net transfers. The surplus in this account was nearly 1.33 billion in 2019-20. So put together, balance in mercantile trade and invisibles, we have the current account balance, which is nearly 25 billion deficit, okay, in 1920. However, in capital account, we had experienced significant surplus to the tune of 84 billion. So 84 billion minus nearly 24.6 billion deficit in current account. So overall balance is nearly 60 billion. You can see that from column number 5. Okay, so when we are having overall balance of payment surplus, that is we are earning more dollar compared to what we are spending or using, so then this reflects in accumulation of forex reserves in the country. So traditionally, accumulation of forex reserves, when it is positive, when it is a surplus, and it is indicated as a negative sign. So as you can see in the last column number 7, we have reserves which is negative nearly 60 billion, reflecting the overall balance in the balance of payment, but with a opposite sign. Now, after discussing about key indicators of government finances and external sector, now let us discuss what is the interlinkage between the two. So to explain that, I'll be using a small bit of macroeconomics, which of course I'll be discussing later in detail when I'll discuss about macroeconomic theories. So in bullet point 1, I have tried to establish the macroeconomic balance, where the left hand side reflects the aggregate expenditure on goods and services produced in a country, and on the right hand side we have representing the use of aggregate income. So in national income accounting, when we'll cover, I'll establish that there is a equality between the two using circular flow of income. Now let me explain what are these symbols represent. C represents aggregate consumption expenditure of the households in the economy. Investment I is represented by I, investment spendings, and G represents government expenditure. X represents exports, that is foreigners spending on uh, goods and services produced domestically. So this is in the left hand side reflecting total expenditure by different stakeholders on goods and services produced within India, okay, or for that matter in any country. On the right hand side, we are basically using uses of overall income generated, okay, while producing goods and services. So overall income which is generated, that is either consumed, so C, or saved, which is given by the symbol S, or paid as tax revenue to the government, which is T, or used to buy goods and services from abroad, which is given as M. So obviously, as I said, today I'm not establishing that, and in the session on national income accounting, I'll establish that aggregate production or aggregate expenditure is equal to aggregate income. So that way the left hand side and right hand side are equal. Now with little mathematical manipulation, if I bring M from the right hand side to the left hand side, and then take all items from left hand side to the right hand side, except X, I'll have X minus M on the left hand side. C from left and right cancel out. So then I have, basically what I'm telling, that I'm cancelling C from both left hand side and right hand side. Okay, cancels out both C. So then I'll have X minus M is equal to S minus I plus T minus G. So S minus I reflects the private sector's saving investment gap. So total amount of saving uh, undertaken by the private sector over the investment expenditure. So this is basically saving investment gap of the private sector, that is households and private corporates in an economy, and T minus G represents total tax revenue mobilized minus government spending. So this in a way reflects public sector saving. So as we discussed earlier, in general there is a government fiscal deficit or budgetary deficit witnessed by governments. Okay, so like in recent year for 2016-17, the fiscal deficit to GDP you know is budgeted at nearly 4.3%, right? So when there is a deficit, government deficit, then T is exceeding T, sorry, G is exceeding T. Okay, for the second term on the right hand side, G, government spending, exceeding government's tax revenue T, right, when there is a deficit. So in that case, if there is no change in S and I, that is private sector saving and investment, or there is a balance in private sector saving and investment, then the gap between G and T will get reflected in the gap between M and X, right? The imports over exports. So when there is government deficit, if for simplicity I assume private sector savings and investment match, then there will be a trade balance. Exports will be equal to imports, right? In that case, if there is a government deficit, G is exceeding T, then M will exceed X. So the government's deficit has a mirror image in trade balance, that is in trade deficit, assuming S and I are balancing. So the data which we uh, collected for India from 1980s suggests that between 1980 to 90, the average public sector saving investment gap was to the tune of 2.3%. So public sector saving investment gap is basically the government deficit plus the saving investment gap of say different PSUs. Okay, like government owns public sector banks, government owns railways, and various departmental and non-departmental PSUs. So the income expenditure gap, or sort of the profitability or loss making, if you take into account, then we'll have the public sector saving investment gap. What I mean, government's deficit added to income expenditure gap of the public sector undertakings will reflect public sector saving investment gap. Okay, so this was the tune of 2.3% of GDP in 1980s, and basically that deteriorated from 5%, 5.6% of GDP to 7%, 7.9% of GDP between 1981-82 to 1989-90. During this period, that is 1980s, the current account deficit also was close to 2 percentage point, which deteriorated from nearly 1.3% to 3.2%. So you can see there is a close interlinkage between public sector saving investment gap and current account deficit. Now, what is the problem when there is a sort of high current account deficit which is persistent? So if current account deficit is high and persistent, and there is not much cross-border capital inflow like it was the situation prior to 1991 in India, then what happens? The forex reserves gradually gets depleted. So given the high fiscal deficit of 1980s and the huge increase in India's import bill in 1970s, particularly due to high energy prices, our forex reserves started depleting, okay, beginning from early 1970s, and in 1991 the forex reserves were hardly 1 billion. I think sometime mid 1991, June 1991, when forex reserves of 1 billion could buy imports for only a couple of weeks. So India was on the verge of bankruptcy or default, right? So that is popularly referred as economic crisis of 1991. Basically, this balance of payment difficulty, that is huge current account deficit, and India running out of the forex reserves, led to economic slowdown in 1991, when Indian economic growth was nearly 0%. I mean, 1 point some percentage point. So this suggests how deteriorating macroeconomic imbalance, that is growing fiscal deficit, I mean high fiscal deficit and high current account deficit, can make an economy vulnerable, particularly due to balance of payment difficulty. Okay, so learning from that experience, we adopted fiscal consolidation and fiscal discipline from early 90s. This reflected in a series of steps, which of course I'll discuss in some other session when I'll discuss about macroeconomic policy in India. So today we are discussing about use of macroeconomic indicators like government deficit and balance of payment indicators to assess overall macroeconomic conditions. So this concludes our discussion on use of various macroeconomic indicators to assess about economic conditions or macroeconomic environment in an economy. If you go back to past session, I told you that to assess the health of an individual, the doctors use various indicators. Okay, they use parameters like blood pressure, the sugar level, lipid profile. Okay, using all those indicators, they assess whether someone is healthy or not healthy. Similarly, the set of key macroeconomic indicators which I discussed about in the last 4 sessions, including today, explain how these indicators can be used to assess overall macroeconomic conditions at a point of time. To summarize, if economic growth is high, if employment rate is high, and inflation is low and stable, that reflects fundamentally very strong macroeconomic conditions in an economy. On the contrary, if economic growth is low or negative, inflation is high or volatile, that reflects adverse or not a conducive macroeconomic environment. In a long-term perspective, if saving rate investment of an economy is high and if financial sector is sound and efficient, that reflects that long-term fundamentals of an economy is very strong. Otherwise, if there are issues related to financial sector crisis, then that leads to vulnerability of the economy, because that will be adversely impacting mobilization of savings and falling investment, and of course the cost for resolution of the financial crisis. Then today we discussed about indicators drawing from public finance and national sector. So particularly if the government's borrowing is within a limit, government's debt is in within a limit, that reflects sound macroeconomic conditions. Similarly, if the balance of payment is in a good condition, particularly if the current account deficit is reasonably low and stable, that also reflects a sound macroeconomic conditions. So this concludes our discussion about use of key macroeconomic indicators to define the economic environment in a particular country. Okay, I hope all these 4 videos were useful for you, and I'll be happy to receive your feedback for any further improvement or to answer any of the queries you have. So next session onwards, I'll be starting some videos on theories of macroeconomics. We'll be discussing about the classical model, Keynesian model, and the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, theories of growth, in broadly 4 videos to cover various theories of macroeconomics, um, briefly. Okay, so thank you for watching my video, and if it is useful, you may please like the video too. Thank you.